May 1945. Germany's submarine force halted patrols and carried out orders to surrender under Allied control. A provisional government operated in Flensburg, with orders signed by Karl Dönitz requiring an immediate end to attacks on convoys. Commanders received short signals with a clear sequence of actions: surface, transmit position, proceed to the designated port, and maintain radio discipline on a fixed schedule. Routes were plotted to Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Britain's west coast, where reception points had been set up in advance. The first mass receptions were conducted at Loch Eriboll and Loch Ryan, where hulls arrived from the Atlantic and the Norwegian approaches. Allied officers recorded pennant numbers, crew complements, remaining ammunition, and machinery condition using standard tables. Crews were taken ashore, while mixed inspection teams, British engineers, Canadian signal specialists, and American torpedo experts worked aboard. Every unit and every cable run went into the inventory to rule out hidden late-war modifications. The key port for offloading and allocation was Lisahally near Londonderry, where the official reception ceremony was held. Hulls were berthed in lines, manning levels were checked, and codebooks along with communications procedures used on ocean patrols were seized. Crews were moved to camps. Petty officers and technicians were questioned about snorkels, hydrophones, and the routine for brief surfacing to charge. The results determined batches for towing, for sea trials, and for short-term training use. At the piers, inspectors recorded types and dimensions to bring the fleet under clear accounting. The Type VII submarine was listed as the backbone ocean boat. Length about 67 metres, 220 feet, beam roughly 6.2 metres, 20.3 feet, draft around 4.7 metres, 15.4 feet, transit speed up to 17 knots, submerged about 7 knots. The Type IX submarine was identified as the long-range hull, length over 76 metres, 249 feet, beam about 6.8 metres, 22.3 feet, draft roughly 5.1 metres, 16.7 feet, speed about 18 knots on the surface and about 7 knots submerged. The newest series received special notes by Roll. Type XXI as a submarine-oriented platform with submerged speed up to 17 knots. Type 23 as a small coastal hull about 34 metres, 112 feet long. And before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you're enjoying this one, don't forget to subscribe and smash a like. Weapons were removed before towing and training runs to eliminate non-standard situations. 533mm torpedo tubes were left empty, while combat torpedoes G7A and G7E were sent to depots with separate fuse labelling. Fuel was pumped out by section. Battery groups were kept at minimal charge with monitoring of gas release and ventilation. 88mm deck guns were removed at once on some hulls, and on others locked in neutral position until they fell in behind the tugs. Allied staffs divided the received hulls into 3 main lines of work. Serviceable examples were requested by the United States and the United Kingdom for shallow water trials and noise measurements at various speeds. The USSR and France received agreed quotas to be ferried to their own bases under temporary flags. The remainder were assigned to planned ocean disposal to prevent any return to service under future political instability. On passages to concentration points, groundings and mechanical failures were recorded, reflected in the reception logs. Older hulls lost tightness at scuppers and piping, held depth uncertainly, and demanded constant dewatering. Tugs rigged additional lines to the stem and deck pad eyes to prevent the hull from slewing in seas and yawing in straits. Temporary layups were arranged in sheltered waters, with the option of re-inspection before departure to western coordinates. From Loch Ryan and Lisahally, short training sorties were conducted under Allied instructors. Engineers measured battery currents, tracked compartment ventilation, and observed snorkel behaviour in short seas. For the Type XXI, they noted the smooth lines and station layout that shifted the entire combat cycle underwater and cut surface time to a minimum. For the Type 23, they noted compactness, fast readiness for launch, and a limited radius suited to port approaches and narrow fairways. Accompanying documentation was brought to a single format to prevent discrepancies between staffs. Tables recorded numbers, names of commanding officers, areas of last patrol, machinery hours, and remaining stores. Separate marks noted traces of emergency repairs, temporary blanking plates, and new cable runs added in the final months of the war. These lists determined the fate of each hull for the coming months, linked to test tasks and disposal. As berths and anchorages filled, headquarters issued orders for the next phase of work. The reasoning was simple. Storing and maintaining hundreds of hulls was too costly, and the technical data had already been gathered. Crews were repatriated on schedule, boats were taken in tow, and prepared to sail to selected points west of Ireland. Scuttling areas were chosen for depth and currents to preclude accidental refloats and beaching. November 1945. Operation Deadlight began, under which batches of captured submarines were taken to western coordinates off Ireland. The method was chosen as a fast and controlled way to rule out any return of hulls to service amid future uncertainty. Tugs took several units at a time. Escort ships controlled corridors and weather by the winter season sailing directions. Scuttling grounds were placed outside shipping lanes where bottom relief and depth would not cause interference. Some boats went to the bottom while still under tow, when old bow compartments flooded and the hull lost stability. Tug masters recorded yaw in the seas and failures of lashings and authorised controlled scuttling charges at a safe distance. On certain passages, escort ships used gunfire to accelerate sinking within short weather windows. Logs recorded time, coordinates, depths, and ammunition expenditure, so each hull had a fixed point of reference. The main body went under over 3 winter months from November 1945 to February 1946. Reports give a figure of about 116 scuttled units from the total surrendered force. The remainder went for teardown and trials in different countries. Trial programs included acoustic measurements underway, comparison of layouts, testing snorkel behaviour in waves, and analysis of battery groups during prolonged submerged running. On later series they noted new hydrophones and a different order of workstations that shifted combat to submerged speed. The United States took several hulls for comparative sorties and laboratory rigs to test prolonged submerged operation and quiet modes. The United Kingdom practiced low-altitude detection of periscopes and snorkel heads, and trained ASW teams on real targets. The USSR received a quota of northern boats and examined pressure hull strength, ergonomics of workstations, and snorkel behaviour at the ice edge. France accepted sound hulls for transitional training tasks and to rebuild its own series. In parallel, detailed teardowns were carried out. Assemblies were removed, weighed, and documented under a single method. Electricians recorded cable routes, mounting methods, and protection against water and battery gases as reworked in the late projects. Mechanics assessed pumps, valves, and closures for mass, service life, and the feasibility of at-sea repairs. Acousticians measured machinery noise and station isolation to understand exactly where the later hulls brought minutes against enemy search. Particular attention went to the Type 21, with length about 76.7 metres, 252 feet, beam roughly 6.6 metres, 21.7 feet, and draft about 6.3 metres, 20.7 feet. Submerged speed up to 17 knots was confirmed on short runs and demanded precise assembly and tuning, something late war yards did not always achieve. Drawings showed smooth hull lines and battery arrangements that allowed long submerged endurance without unnecessary surfacing. These solutions fed into post-war programs where submerged speed and quiet became priorities. For the Type VIII, they recorded a length around 34.7 meters, 114 feet. The layout was simple and clear for a small crew and provided advantageous handling in shallow water within narrow channels. Testers checked snorkel stability in steep seas and protection of machinery from slugging inflow through the valve. These observations were used in developing domestic coastal boats to cover short defensive sectors. Operational conclusions were phrased without ornament. Prolonged submerged running became the norm, and surfacing was treated as a short technical pause. Anti-submarine defense shifted emphasis to long-range aviation, high-frequency sonar, and a direct link from the bridge to the weapons post. Practice showed that dividing the enemy's effort between open ocean and port approaches worked when air control was continuous. These decisions were fixed in new curricula where sensors, tactics, and energy were treated as a single system. By the spring of 1946, the hulls either lay in the deadlight areas or stood under guard at the piers for further sorties. Engineers completed primary inspections of key assemblies and drew up checklists for trials at sea. Crews were tasked to verify snorkels, battery groups, and handling during extended submergence with careful accounting of minutes of energy. From there, the work shifted from disposal to study, because each assembly could still yield practical value. Spring 1946. Test centres took captured hulls to sea to compare pierside figures with real work in a seaway. The United States, the United Kingdom, the USSR, and France accepted serviceable boats and ferried them to their bases for comparable trials. On every sortie they recorded energy consumption, time sustained at periscope depth, and snorkel stability in short seas. Results were distilled into simple tables that later rewrote training syllabi and maintenance regulations. The main focus fell on the Type XXI submarine, whose entire combat cycle was shifted underwater, with surfacing reduced to a short technical pause. They noted a length of about 76.7 meters, 252 feet, beam roughly 6.6 meters, 21.7 feet, draft around 6.3 meters, 20.7 feet. At forced power, they confirmed submerged speed up to 17 knots. But the value lay not in the number itself, rather in quiet machinery and the logic of workstations. The drawing showed batteries and ventilation coordinated with movement routes inside the compartments, without crossing flows or unnecessary transitions. Alongside, they studied the Type 23 submarine as a compact hull for narrow fairways and harbour approaches. They recorded a length around 34.7 metres, 114 feet, with a straightforward layout for a small crew. At sea, they noted quick mode changes and predictable snorkel behaviour in short, gusty seas. Range was limited by design intent, but handling in shallow water was cleaner than on pre-war series with tall profiles and surplus superstructures. In the United States, the Guppy modernisation line was launched for domestic diesel-electric boats, borrowing the Type 21 smoothed forms and snorkel. Hull resistance underwater was reduced, battery groups were increased in capacity, and power cables were rerouted to cut trunk hum. Trials were run in series, tying speed in knots to decibels and to voltage drop across discharge steps. Test stands checked element cooling, so long submerged legs would not burn through battery life ahead of schedule. The United Kingdom rebuilt the detect-to-attack chain because the new submerged speed changed the timeline of closing. Designers reduced sail fairwater area, refined periscope profiles, and tuned steering gear to hold a steady course without oscillation. From Type 21 examples, they noted the useful separation of quiet and noisy stations. which allowed many hours submerged without overloading crews. Training plans shifted priorities and built the rhythm around short periscope depth windows instead of long surface transits. The USSR ran sea comparisons and assembled a package of solutions for its own series without direct copying. Priorities were hull forms with low submerged resistance, a reliable snorkel for northern weather, and battery groups with well-planned ventilation. The result was the Project 613 submarine, where layout and power were subordinated to prolonged submerged running without excessive surfacing. In parallel, they prepared the Project 611 submarine for long routes, with fuel and volume reserves sized for ocean tasks. France used the captures as a bridge to its own school and fielded the Narval-class submarine. Electricians rewrote cable runs with regard to battery gas emission and ventilation regimes under deep discharge. Mechanics proved out pumps, valves and closures so the duty cycle would survive long submergence without unnecessary interventions en route. At sea they checked snorkel stability and valve response to wave snatch, because coastal weather often sets hard conditions. Weapons were treated as a timeline from decision to launch without extra surface operations. 533mm torpedo tubes were adopted as the common caliber. Differences were reduced to feed, locking and tray maintenance. Stands tested contact and electromechanical fuses, cavitation tolerance, and depth-keeping accuracy with sea state in mind. Reload time was tuned to the new rhythm, so a second shot could be made while submerged without overloading the crew. Acousticians from different countries reached the same conclusion. Mechanical quiet buys minutes at periscope depth and spoils the escort's lead. Separating noisy units, using soft mounts, and routing runs intelligently cut vibration into the pressure hull and gained distance for covert approach. Test crews matched self-noise bands to the sea's background and trimmed pumps and fans with fine settings. This experience moved into drawings and maintenance rules where every mode was tied to a task on the route. In the end, a simple formula was fixed. The boat lives underwater, and surfacing remains a short pause for charging. Navigation and attack are built around minutes of energy, and the area's acoustic map not around the window of topside visibility. Crews learn to count minutes of energy like ammunition, because those minutes purchase the approach to firing position. Thus, the post-war school is formed, where hull, sensors and power are treated as one system rather than a heap of separate units. Once conclusions moved into practice, anti-submarine defense changed both sequence and toolset. Maritime patrol aviation received the magnetic anomaly detector as a means of final target confirmation over periscope depth. Low-altitude radars confidently picked up snorkel heads and periscope tips at short range in calm water. The aircraft ship link worked without pauses, passing target coordinates and speed straight to the weapons posts. Escort ships moved away from stern-dropped depth charges and adopted forward-throwing weapons. Decks received fan-pattern mortars in 178mm and 324mm calibers that covered the contact at several ranges with a single salvo. The sonar set held the target through launch and then managed the quiet window across the burst sector. This sequence removed the blind zone under the keel and enabled attacks on the computed point without passing over the submarine. Long-range aviation shifted to heavy patrol aircraft with long on-station time and a full sensor suite. Crews layered radar, radio sonobuoys, and magnetic data for triple confirmation of contact. At night they used searchlights and surface light markers to keep reference in broken seas and avoid losing the burst sector. Communications channels were shielded against interference because a 1-second delay breaks the detect-to-attack chain. Submarine schools rewrote courses around extended submerged running and rare snorkel windows. The navigator's task became allocating energy along the route, where each knot of speed shows up in the battery remainder at the end of the hour. Commanders drilled quick checks of course and time at periscope depth without showing unnecessary profile above the wavetops. Attacks were executed from a computed sector, with egress at low speed to avoid leaving an acoustic trail for backtracking. On the defence side, sonar complexes were strengthened and direct bridge-to-weapons line was introduced so no second was lost in corridors. Training teams worked against real captured hulls and learned to hear target drift and sound delays in water layers. Area charts were drawn for currents and noise backgrounds because false contacts on bottom slopes complicate decisions. Regulations fix short commands and simple signals so any turn would be executed without surplus words. On drawing boards, a new hull geometry took hold where submerged speed and energy reserve determine the shape. The sail and masts were cut to the necessary minimum to reduce radar visibility and flow resistance. Compartments were divided by noise sources and by maintenance tasks, so repairs would not spread vibration to neighbouring stations. Sensors were tied to motion, because without that link, time underwater becomes a random expenditure. The experience of different fleets converged on one point. Without long submerged endurance and quiet power, a submarine cannot force the fight. The Type XXI remained the teaching benchmark from which national series and post-war regulations diverged. Project 613 and Project 611 showed how borrowed solutions became a mass school and long routes. The French naval and the British post-war classes repeated the main principle. The submerged part matters more than the surfaced part, and seconds of energy are worth more than miles on top. By the early 1950s, the post-war school had fixed the rule. The boat lives underwater, and surfacing remains a short technical pause. Designers drove hulls towards smooth lines, separated noises by compartments, and stitched sensors into the motion cycle. Fleets received their own series, but the language of decisions became common. Minutes of energy are dearer than miles on the surface, and more important than showy topside speed. The remaining task was to preserve and explain this experience so the hardware would speak for itself, without extra words. In the late 1950s, hulls remained in ports that could be safely shown to the public and engineers, and commissions selected those that would survive years of open-air mooring. Organisers removed hazardous components, isolated high-voltage lines, and drafted preservation routines with clear cycles of dehumidifying and airing. Visitor routes inside the compartments were laid out so people could see real stations without dangerous passages and without tight doors with sharp edges. Lighting was placed locally at the chart tables and instruments to leave unnecessary surfaces in shadow and keep attention on specific assemblies. In northern Germany, they prepared a Type VII submarine for display, known to the public as the Museum Hull at Lebow, and on it you can feel the scale of ocean service. Length about 67.1 metres, 220 feet, beam roughly 6.2 metres, 20.3 feet, draft around 4.7 metres, 15.4 feet, and these numbers become not a table, but steps through a cramped passage between bunks and torpedo trays. The 533mm torpedo tubes remain with transparent covers, so the guides, locks and cable points for a remote detonator are visible. Outside, curators watch the riveted seams and the corrosion hotspots at knees and brackets, because sea air quickly finds weak points in the plating. In the United States, the exhibit is built around a Type IXC submarine, and the larger compartment volume gives a different sense of interior space compared with the smaller series. Length, about 76.8 metres, 252 feet, wider passages, and along the tour line there is room for a group and a stand with a cutaway of the snorkel valve. Visitors are shown the diesel engines, the electric drives of the propeller shafts, and the connection points where the switch to submerged running is seen as a set of simple selections. To preserve the hull, dehumidification systems and controlled ventilation are installed to keep humidity at a level that does not destroy cable varnish and does not eat the steel of the frames. In Bremerhaven, engineers return a Type XXI submarine to operating condition, not as a parade gesture, but as a way to show the logic of a submarine-oriented platform. Length roughly 76.7 metres, 252 feet, submerged speed up to 17 knots, and these parameters are read not from a placard but from the long, lower corridor and the low profile of the sail's fairwater. Inside, it is clear how the battery groups lie in two long belts, and how ventilation separates warm and cool flows so the crew can work without unnecessary air mixing. The exhibit emphasizes the smooth lines and the workstation layout, where each mechanism has its own acoustic signature and does not interfere with its neighbour. Preserving a boat is not about selling tickets. It is routine work the visitor never sees, the work that keeps the metal in shape. Technicians measure compartment humidity, monitor gas release from residual batteries, and keep a log of filter cleaning to prevent chemical damage from within. The hull is regularly washed with fresh water and coated with systems that block salt and hold electrochemical vapours at a safe level. These actions follow a schedule with materials and tolerances, and slipping the timeline shows up on the steel surface the very next season. The human side of the exhibit is assembled briefly and to the point, from the names of commanders to patrol routes tied to simple maps. The placards show Karl Dönitz, the dates of surrender orders, and the lists of passages to Loch Eriboll, Loch Ryan, and Lisahally, so the visitor can see the hull's journey from ocean to pier. In display cases lie deck logs with pencil corrections to time and course, and beside them hangs a plain officer's compass that turns the entry into a tangible tool. This set does not ask for belief on words alone. It gives the viewer objects through which the strain of the work is read without grand phrasing. Separate rooms are devoted to countermeasures, showing the chain of detection and attack as a sequence of time and decisions. Stands hold models of forward-throwing mortars of 178mm and 324mm calibers, which covered the contact with several ranges and removed the blind zone beneath the keel. On screens, brief diagrams explain how radar picks up a snorkel head, and how the sonar set holds the target up to launch and after launch through the quieting window. Nearby lies a late series hydrophone, and a plate of soft mounting to show how machinery noise is absorbed by material rather than carried into the pressure hull. The post-war scuttling areas remain on charts as sites of memory and as ranges for science, and this changes the tone of the conversation about the seabed. Researchers lower remotely operated vehicles and film the condition of the metal to understand how currents and corrosion open seams and where plating still holds. On screen are valve slots, torn covers, and places where growth has hidden a number, and these frames return to the docks as direct hints for restorers. Zones are marked as areas not to be touched, because this is not a pile of scrap, but underwater graves with exact coordinates and recorded depths. Museum programs add short explanations by engineers without judgment or pathos, and that voice helps keep the language clear. Visitors are shown why later hull forms strive for smooth surfaces where energy is saved and how water resistance drops in transit. A panel lets you compare machinery noise by frequency and see how soft mounts reduce vibration transmitted to the pressure hull, turning that experience into a tangible curve. One stand holds a periscope with lens markings. Another mounts a snorkel valve with its closure time, and both items function as simple proofs. The final section of the route is kept quiet, without large murals and without long texts, where objects stand that are easy to understand at first glance. A hand wheel, a nameplate stating its function, an emergency line closure instruction in a few steps, and a lamp on a flexible stalk nearby so you can read without glare. This language has no invented terms and no opaque abbreviations. It has an object, and the action it performs with a set time and a set sequence. The person leaves not with a slogan, but with a set of clear images that add up to the simple mechanics of service underwater. The technical legacy of wartime submarines enters post-war projects as a set of proven units and as layout rules that have survived real water. Designers no longer treat surface running as the working mode and build the main cycle for submerged operation with short periscope depth windows for communications and charging. Drawings lose unnecessary steps and shoulders. The sail fairwater becomes lower, and the hull lines move toward a smooth form that saves knots of speed and minutes of energy. Inside, compartments are divided by noise sources so that each mechanism has its acoustic signature and does not disrupt neighbouring stations during long submergence. On the American side, the modernizations proceed under the name GUPI, and here they use ideas from the Type XXI without copying every detail. Hulls receive a smoothed profile, larger battery groups, and a snorkel as a standard tool so charging does not require a long run on the surface. In trials, speed in knots is tied directly to decibels and to voltage drop across discharge steps, and this becomes the plain language of decision-making at sea. That language simplifies the conversation between captain, navigator, and electrician, because every minute underwater has a price in energy and in noise, and that price is visible on the instruments. British classes move to forms where the submerged part matters more than the surfaced one, and where sensors and weapons are stitched into a single rhythm of motion. Designers reduce masts and refine periscope profiles so radar has fewer targets, and flow has fewer steps. Steering machines are tuned for a smooth course without oscillation, which gives acoustics more time to hold contact and to work forward-throwing systems. On ranges, they test how quickly a target can be maintained and a salvo brought to the computed point, and these times go into manuals without grand language. Soviet designs take a package of solutions from captured material and build their own school, with the Project 613 submarine becoming the baseline. Hull length holds to a middle range. The power plant is calculated for long submerged running with rare snorkel windows, and compartments are separated by noise and by maintenance tasks. For longer routes, they field the Project 611 submarine, where fuel reserve and compartment volume extend operating geography in the north and on ocean lines. On ranges, they record acoustic portraits and set regulations that account for salinity, temperature, and wave impact, and these tables go to line units. The French school arrives at the Naval-class submarine, where maintenance experience becomes as valuable a resource as metal and machinery power. Electricians route cables with regard to battery gas emission and ventilation regimes to avoid accumulating dangerous mixtures in the lower belts. Mechanics give priority to valves and pumps that survive long, submerged cycles without excessive interventions and without unnecessary disassembly en route. At sea, they test snorkel stability and valve response to a wave's jerk, because coastal weather often sets tough conditions in narrow passages. Museum hulls prove useful not only to the public, but also to design bureaus, which use them to explain solutions to future crews and repair services. On a real boat, you see why a passage is narrow, where a cable lies, and how access to a valve opens, and this reduces operating errors. A wall diagram shows the air route through the compartments, and from that scheme it is easy to understand why a bend stands exactly there, and how the line is shut in an emergency. Such demonstration removes extra questions and preserves a common language between the shop floor, the ship, and the hall where history is kept. Scientific expeditions continue work in scuttling areas, and the seabed yields not only metal, but data for engineering decisions ashore. Cameras show where plating still holds, and where a seam is opened under the load of currents and corrosion, and these observations return to the docks as practical recommendations. Restorers select coatings and refine drying regimes from live footage rather than general rules, and museum hulls last longer without crude patches. Thus a feedback loop appears in which the sea shows what worked and where new technology is required. The atomic age changes the scale but does not cancel the lessons learned on diesel-electric boats, and the key rules remain the same. Hull forms again stretch towards smooth lines without unnecessary steps. Compartments are again divided by noise and by maintenance access, and sensors are woven into the motion cycle as a single instrument. Speed in knots remains the language of navigation, and minutes underwater remain a currency that cannot be spent without calculation, and that calculation rests on the instrument and the chart. Reactor size does not change the physics of water and sound, which is why the mid-century principles continue to work without big words. In a modern museum, a screen hangs beside the hull with a simple graph that links knots to energy and noise, and the visitor sees a line, not a slogan. On the table lies a periscope with lens markings and focus rings that you can turn to understand how light travels and why height matters for angle. On a stand is mounted a snorkel valve with a note on its closure time, and that time is checked with a stopwatch rather than described with pretty words. This set keeps the conversation about war and technology calm and clear, because each element can be seen, turned, and accepted as a fact.